All right, crim 28. Let's knock out chapter 8. Residential community supervision programs. Doesn't that sound like just ridiculously exciting? Okay, sorry, it doesn't, but it's really not that bad. Okay, learning objectives, blah, 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 and blah. You can read them. Oh, sorry. You can read them all, and you can pause if you want to write them all down. Okay. Introduction. Intermediate sanctions. Those are sentencing options that are between prison and probation that provide more freedom than prison, but less freedom than probation. These are things like halfway houses, work release programs, and boot camps. So we're going to start with halfway houses, the oldest and most common type of community residential facilities. And RCCF's residential community correctional facilities. So that's basically your halfway houses. And when they say halfway houses, they basically mean you're halfway in and halfway out. So meaning you're halfway in custody and halfway out of custody. So they house people that are on their way out of custody, and they might house people that might be on their way back into custody. So they're pre-release centers, restitution centers, drug treatment facilities, work release centers. These are all things that could be considered these residential community correctional facilities. A lot of times halfway houses are the places where people would go when they were getting ready to get released from prison and maybe they didn't have anywhere to live. As you can imagine, when a person ends up in prison, a lot of times they've burned a lot of people in their lives. Maybe their families and loved ones and friends don't want them to come live with them, so they might have to try and scrounge around to get a job or find someone who will even let them come live with them. So that's kind of one of the issues, finding housing. And some of them just need, the extra re-entry assistance. So halfway houses can really help those people. And a lot of people, if you can imagine, you're in custody for 20 years, just kind of getting thrown out to the wolves immediately from prison can obviously be pretty challenging. So halfway houses, now granted, you probably don't want one next door to you, but they probably could be pretty helpful for a lot of these parolees. So the history dates back to England and Ireland in the 1800s. The United States, state and public support for that, the halfway house was not there. So a lot of nonprofits and private corporations opened them in the United States. There was some government assistance, but most of them still today are are funded by private institutions or private corporations. Some states, counties, jurisdictions rely on them more than others. Halfway houses in the Fresno area used to be really common. We still have some, but they're not as common as they used to be. It used to be a bunch of them in the Tower District. That was like the place for all the halfway houses. And I think it was because they had big homes there that weren't very expensive, which kind of sucked because there was a lot of really beautiful homes there and you had a lot of parolees living in them. So it was kind of, again, great for the parolees, kind of rough for the neighbors. But private halfway houses choose their clients. They will interview people and decide who they're going to have in their homes. They do contract with the government, and they get a certain amount of money per day per client. And the offenders are also expected to assist financially. There are some shared features. Typically, halfway house, you are expected to live there. You are expected to be employed. You are expected to leave the facility to work, and you are expected to prove that you are working. You are expected to keep up on rent and to leave be approved for, if you're not there and you're not at work, you better have proof. That's what I'm trying to say. You also have a level system. Maybe you earn a little more freedom based on behavior and maybe length of time that you've been there. So if it's your first month there, you're probably on a blackout period. You can go to work and come home and that's it. Maybe after you've been there 2 months, you're allowed to, maybe go to lunch one time. Then, maybe the next month you're able to maybe go out on a date, one night or whatever. You get what I mean. You get to earn privileges. And that's kind of the way that they help you to earn your way back into the community to transition out of the halfway house. And then they have staff. Typically, you're going to have people that are there for security, and you're going to have people that are there for treatment. They have very strict rules. Typically, no drugs, no alcohol. Behavior has to be, obviously no violence, that kind of stuff. So they're pretty well maintained. Female offenders are typically really good candidates for these types of halfway houses, because most of the time, not always, but most of the time, women are nonviolent offenders, and they're usually dealing with mental health issues and or substance abuse issues. Sometimes there are, like this John Crane house in Indiana allows the women to live there with their children. I'm sure that the rules are even more strict at a home like this. But a lot of these halfway homes for female offenders are going to deal with gender-specific issues. And we know that women do have a lot of gender-specific issues that typically are going to deal with their own children and learning how to parent their children better. Work release programs is something else. And there's a lot of different ways that work release programs work. If any of you watched that Jeffrey Epstein documentary thing that was on, I think it was on Netflix. I can't remember now, but I think it was on Netflix, where they talked about how Jeffrey Epstein got arrested for trafficking youth or something like that. And then he was in, was he in prison or jail? I can't remember. But anyways, he was able to do a work release program. So he would work all week, and I'm doing air quotes, work all week. And then he came back to jail. I think it was jail on the weekends. That was a type of work release program. There are a lot of different types of work release programs. Sometimes offenders will be supervised and they'll go out all day and work and be supervised by a correctional officer. Sometimes they're allowed to actually leave the facility, go to work, not be supervised, and come back. Sometimes they leave the whole week and they come back on the weekends only. It's very different depending on, I guess, probably how dangerous the offender is. Typically, if you're a dangerous offender, you're not going to be doing a work release program. But if you're a very low risk offender, you might be able to even, leave the facility by yourself and only serve weekends in custody. You've probably seen some inmates. A lot of them will do the median work around the city of Fresno. I've seen them before in there. They have like navy blue jumpsuits from the Fresno County Jail. I'm sure you're aware that there are some prisoners from CDCR who work with CAL FIRE. So there's a lot of different types of work release programs. So eligibility and the programs do vary. Provides the offender with an opportunity to learn skills, retain employment, get money to pay their victims back, maybe even support their own families a little bit. So that's also something that's a good idea. So like I said, there's two types. You can be supervised or unsupervised. Offenders who leave a work site and don't return on time will have a warrant issued for their arrest, of course, so they are not allowed to leave. There are restitution centers where people are able to actually go to a certain center. Work-capable offenders who owe victim restitution can go there and work. And they will earn money, and everything that they earn will go to their victims, which sounds like a win-win. And there are, your book, I don't know what page, 91 and 192 talk about some different restitution centers in Texas and Florida. And I think there was another one. Texas, Florida, and Texas and Florida and Washington. So yeah, check that out. Work ethic camps. This was kind of basically what they were talking about here is they put people through like a substance abuse-ish therapy type program first, and then they put them through like a job skills program next. And they said this worked really well to keep their the clients on track. So anyways, interesting. Shock incarceration is something that's been used a lot as well. And I'm going to tell from my personal experience, I didn't think that shock incarceration was real effective. But shock incarceration was basically a brief period of incarceration followed by supervised probation, parole, intermittent imprisonment, that kind of stuff. And the whole goal basically was to lock someone up for a brief period of time and basically hopefully scare them into complying with the hopes that they would be so fearful when they got locked up that they would not want to get locked up again, and they would just magically comply. Unfortunately, most of them really didn't care in my in my experience. They were like, I don't care, lock me up again, I don't care. But anyways, the goal was to get to young offenders with no previous adult incarceration. So I'm sure it works somewhere. I didn't have any luck with it, but this is shock incarceration. You're trying to basically scare them into compliance. Correctional boot camps. This makes me very sad because correctional boot camps were the thing. They were like, everybody was opening up boot camps in, I don't know, maybe the late 90s, early 2000s. And, everybody was using them. Everybody had boot camps, and they were like boot camps. They were like militaristic style programs where they had, basically young people, young offenders. Some of them were just juveniles. Some of them were young adults. And it was a militaristic style program where, it was like you had a drill sergeant that was, yelling at you all day and all night. And they were trying to basically tear you down to build you back up into a better person, which is basically the concept of what the military does. Trying to instill discipline and structure into the lives of these offenders. And in my experience, I cannot tell you how many young people I saw change for the better. However, I have to tell you, let's see, it's on page 198 of your book. There's a little section called Truth or Fiction, and it says, Truth or Fiction. Most correctional boot camps closed because they did not significantly lower recidivism enough to justify the increased cost. And that is true. The attitudes of boot camp participants changed in a positive direction in the short term, but once the offenders left the boot camps, their behaviors eventually reverted back to the same as if the offenders never went through the boot camp. So it's very sad because you can't follow the offender home and make sure unfortunately the offender eventually goes home. It was about a 6 to 9 month program typically, and we had a juvenile boot camp program here in Fresno County, and I saw young people change, and it was just amazing to see. And sadly, they just didn't work. There were a lot of reasons why, but they were a form of shock incarceration. I mean, you get the kids out there on their first day, they would get their heads shaved, and they would basically make them run until they threw up. And by the end of the program, these were respectful youth who knew structure, who wanted structure. But The economy went down quickly in about 2008, and so did the boot camp. So anyways, you can have a boot camp type program inside of a prison. You can have maybe like one whole pod be a boot camp type pod, or a standalone facility, which is what we had here in Fresno County, the Elkhorn Correctional Facility boot camp. It's out in the area off of Highway 41 in Elkhorn, kind of near Carruthers. Again, I thought they were great programs, but ultimately the numbers did not prove that. So most of them are closed now. So these are just some other types of programs that are kind of, that halfway house community intermediate sanction type of programs. One of the big problems that they talked about with boot camp programs is this concept of net widening. So I hate trying to describe net widening. So I'm going to do it this way. Net widening. Imagine, I'm not going to talk about crime at all right now, but I'm going to get back to it. Imagine you are a fisherman and you want to get some ahi tuna. And you go out to the ocean and you throw this giant net out to catch some ahi tuna. And you throw the giant net out, and when you pull that net back in it, you have some ahi tuna, but you also have some dolphins, some sharks, and some turtles, some sea turtles. You don't need those dolphins, sharks, or sea turtles. And you probably just messed them all up because you brought them in too. All you really wanted was the ahi tuna, but since you got the others, you're going to keep them. Okay? All right. So, the concept of boot camp programs. When you have a program that has 150 beds, you're going to do everything you can to make sure all 150 of those beds are full. Are you always going to have them full with people who really need the program? Or is it occasionally, sometimes you're going to think, well, we really need this bed filled because we need the money that we get to fill those beds. This guy probably doesn't really need the program, but we need to fill that bed, so we're going to put him in it. Does that make sense? That's net widening. I'm pulling someone into this program that doesn't really need it just because I have that program. I hope that makes sense. And the confrontational style can have negative outcomes for abuse of power and violence. And that's it.